Super. So, okay, well, good evening, and thanks for joining us tonight for the second workshop in the Port St. Lucie Boulevard Corridor Study. My name's Kim Delaney. I'm with the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council, and we're assisting the city in developing a corridor plan to look at Port St. Lucie Boulevard from particularly Gatlin Boulevard to Becker Road, but really how that roadway functions into the neighborhoods, and there are other ideas that can be extended onto other roadways as well. Thank you for that. So with me tonight is Lauren Clark from the Regional Planning Council office, and also Laura Dodd is the city's project manager, who will be back in the room in just a moment. And also Amy Eason is here from the city staff. Amy's responsible in the Stormwater division. So before we get started, since we don't have a huge crowd here, let's just have a chance to introduce ourselves to each other, if that's okay. So if you can let us know if you, what your name is, and if you live in the city, and how long you've been in the city, that would be great to know. So I'll start over here on the side. Sorry, I caught you when you were drinking.
Hi, my name is Jean Frias. I've been here 30 years on Southwest McCoy Boulevard, Southwest McCoy Avenue. And the project's been a long time. We've been waiting for a little attention out here. Finally, yay!
Yay! So, great. And Jenny, I recall you from the last workshop, I think, right?
Yes.
So, super. Guys. I'm sorry, which wood?
The Southwest Abode.
Abode, got it.
Which is south of Becker off of Port St. Lucie Boulevard.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
My name's Ed Mansell. Same thing, but Abode Avenue. That's all it is. And if we get concerned with what's going to go in the corners, the four corners right there.
Sure. So, okay. It's good that you raised that question. I may add a couple of images as we get into the discussion, just to give you an idea. So, sir.
My name is Greg Croyle. I live down on Southwest Jarrett Street. I've been here for 5 years now, and I use Port St. Lucie Boulevard a lot. So I'm really interested in what's going on here.
Cool. Okay. Thanks. Young man. Super. Okay, great. Thanks. So everybody's a resident of the city, so that makes it in the room. But of course, we're running this workshop in a hybrid format, so there's a whole crowd of thousands online, or who knows how many, in Zoom as well. So just for the record, we're in a public meeting. If you have a cell phone, if you could put it on silent or vibe, that would be great. Although it's really interesting to hear ringtones, it's sometimes kind of hard to kind of follow the conversation when that happens. If you need restrooms, restrooms are down the hall. There are refreshments in the back. And then I wanted to introduce Laura Dodd. Laura is the senior planner for the city. No, new title is...
Senior Transportation Planner.
Senior Transportation Planner. And Laura's been the project manager for the city. So with that, tonight's presentation is a follow-up to a workshop that we had back earlier part of this year. The purpose of a corridor plan is to look at the relationship between transportation and land use facilities. Try to get more efficiency, make a safer corridor if we can, better land use patterns, more productivity where we can find that, better quality of life. So they're very broad in their focus, and so it's not just looking at the roadway itself. Sometimes folks think a corridor plan, well, how many lanes are you going to have and when are they going to arrive? We have that as part of our analysis and presentation, but it's a much broader study than just looking at the roadway itself. The Regional Planning Council is a public agency. So I work for the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council. Florida has 10 regional planning councils, and we're designed to be extensions of city staff and agency staff. So we only work with the public sector, although we do work public-private when there's a private investor coming in to, for example, build a project in a city. Sometimes cities have us come in. Well, that wasn't my phone. Thank God I did turn mine off. So there we go. So the Treasure Coast region covers 4 counties: Palm Beach, Martin, St. Lucie, and Indian River counties. We have a 28-member board, which has 18 elected officials and 10 gubernatorial appointees. So it's really a public-private board. We were created back in the 1970s when Florida's growth management really started to take off, and cities realized they might need some extra extra assistance, and the state realized that as well. So that's how we're designed. We have a variety of specialties on the staff, so public policy, transportation, land use, urban design, architecture, environmental preservation, economic development. So that's our background. And in this venture, the city reached out to us to ask us to assist the city staff and the public in having a conversation about Port St. Lucie Boulevard. With respect to public input, I mentioned this workshop is the second workshop. The first one, Jeannie turned out with us back in January, along with about 40 people in the room and about 40 people online. So we had a pretty good participation back in our kickoff workshop to get ideas about what are the kinds of questions we should be exploring as we think about how the corridor performs. And we heard a whole lot from the public. What we heard was, it's the PSL Speedway. So there's a lot more speeding that makes it, than could be safe for folks to walk or bike or even drive on the corridor. We need transit on the corridor. We need wider sidewalks and street trees. It's too crowded. There are too many new single-family homes being constructed, even though that is the default condition, right? So we have platted lots of record in the city. So any single-family lot that exists can be built as a single-family lot. So nothing would ever suggest those rights would be taken away. However, that means a lot of driveways intersecting the roadway, and that creates different problems when it comes to traffic circulation and access and mobility as well. And so if not single-family homes, the public said, can you think about other things that might be appropriate otherwise? And the city's already taken some steps to try to allow different types of development, and we have some illustrations for that for you to think about this evening. The widening of the road is overdue. The city needs more playgrounds and active space and tree canopy and fitness trails and things to do and places to go, because the city is long on population but short on those kinds of destinations. Intersections are becoming more challenging. Pardon me. We need to be concerned and mindful about paying for improvements if we identify them, and so the improvements that we've identified, we can have that conversation as well. There needs to be more housing that's affordable. Housing prices, what we heard from residents, housing prices are escalating rapidly. We all know that as residents in the city. We all know what the values are doing. And what that means is people are getting priced out of the market. We don't have a lot of diversity in housing choices. There are lots of single-family residential units, but there aren't a lot of other types of units for kids graduating from high school and looking for a place to live, kids coming home from college who can't afford to buy a house, people who are aging out in the community, who have become empty nesters and can't maintain a home anymore and a yard, or don't want to. So we don't have as many housing choices as would be desirable for a sustainable, resilient economy and community. Canal banks are an opportunity, what we heard in the workshop. We have quite a few canal banks and stormwater facilities, but we don't have a lot of publicly owned land. And so maybe we should think about doing something along those corridors to add some aesthetic improvement to the community. And then finally, of course, we know that residential has tended to convert to commercial over time, and that's something that we should be mindful on the corridor, because that creates different conditions when single-family homes now then become operating as small businesses. So that said, just a little background, if you will. The city of Port St. Lucie is one of the fastest growing cities, not just in the state of Florida, in the United States. It's now the 7th largest city in the state, and the largest city in the Treasure Coast region. And the city's done a really excellent job of documenting how quickly it's growing. But just by way of illustration, looking at our population, we're already at 214,000 people and projected to surpass 300,000 in the next few years. With rapid population growth comes an impact on services and facilities and infrastructure that creates the need to have conversations like this one. Take a pause for a moment and reconsider land use patterns before that next wave of investment and residents land on the ground. The kinds of trends that we talked about in our last workshop and the kinds of trends that we ask communities to consider as we think about planning are summarized on this next few slides. One of those trends is our population demographic is changing in Florida. It's changing across the globe and across the country, and in Florida as well. We're getting older and younger at the same time, right? The baby boomer population is actually going to be the smaller segment of the population. What's growing, though, are are the millennials and zillennials, or Zoomers, which are the next generation down. Millennials actually will be 50% of the workforce in the next 10 years. And also, Florida is getting older as a community at the same time. And so those different ends of the demographic spectrum have different needs. They're not all single-family homeowners and single-family renters. Sometimes they're looking for other housing choices. They have other impacts on the kind of infrastructure connectivity that we need in terms of mobility. If everyone has to drive, but not everyone has a car, there's a segment of the population that gets left out. Also, as we age as a community, having those other transportation choices makes us more successful and connected to the community we live in. What we know is that buyers across the country are seeking healthy lifestyles and walkable places. This is not a COVID trend. This is a pre-COVID trend that was accelerated during COVID, where increasingly buyers are looking for communities where they can leave the front door and walk somewhere other than the mailbox or around the neighborhood, but actually walk to a destination. That's an opportunity the city has along this corridor to introduce some destinations for residents to access. Many cities are looking for opportunities to become what's referred to as a 15-minute neighborhood or a 15-minute city. So what are the things you can access within 15 minutes of your front door? Can you get to work? Can you get to school? Can you meet the daily needs of life? Can you access restaurants, grocery stores, retail uses as you need them, offices as well? That 15-minute access is a kind of a measure of success for many cities across the state and across the nation. We know there's demand, rising demand, for different residential types. Again, the city is a city that has 80,000 platted lots of record, lots of single-family residential in the city of Port St. Lucie. However, not a lot of choices in those other categories of residential use. Townhouses, senior living, attached homes, apartments or condos, very difficult to find in the city, and when they become available, usually they are leased pre-construction because there's so much demand for those other uses. We know that demand is associated with the demographic shifts that we have as a nation and as a state. And so there's an opportunity to diversify the city's economy and make it more competitive and sustainable with different housing choices. There's also a growing demand for mixed-use buildings, and mixed use can take place either vertically, residential ground floor, non-residential above, or horizontally, right? Where you have residential on one side of a lot, one side of a property, and non-residential on another. So that demand for mixed use is rising as well. Neighborhood commercial uses, as I mentioned, if all you can do from your front door is really walk comfortably to your mailbox as your destination and back again, we lose opportunity. So when there's an opportunity to walk to neighborhood commercial, what we find across the country is people tend to do that because it creates variety, it's less expensive, it gets you out of your house, it makes for a healthier place. So neighborhood commercial is an opportunity along the corridor as it infills over time. We also know that mobility, the way people travel around the community, is diversifying as well. So when you think about how people travel in Port St. Lucie today, sometimes we're myopic because we're often driving, and so we're paying attention to mostly the car in front of us or the car behind us. But as you broaden your view and look at communities today, what you find is the traveling public is taking different choices to get to destinations, sometimes just for recreation, but increasingly for purpose-based trips. So people are walking, biking, using different personal mobility devices like scooters and one-boards and hoverboards. We also have folks that need to use wheelchairs and have different transportation needs as a result. Transit is rising as a service, though we don't have transit on the corridor today. Transit is coming long-term, and what we know is every transit trip starts and stops typically as a pedestrian. Usually if you're taking the bus, you have to access the bus stop. And when you get off the bus, your destination is usually not the next bus stop, but it's something nearby. So that transit trip always has a pedestrian component to it to create better access. So what we know is that a way cities find paths to become more sustainable is focusing on a concept that's referred to as complete streets. And so complete streets are streets that accommodate all different types of users. Whether you're in a personal vehicle, if you're in transit, or you're biking, walking, or using other type of personal mobility mode, the street's designed to make it comfortable for everyone, not just for the cars to go quickly, right? So transportation planning has tended to focus mostly on cars moving quickly, and what that's done is limited the function of roadways for other users. So Complete Streets tries to broaden that perspective and create roadway facilities, transportation facilities that better accommodate the other users as well. Why is that important in Port St. Lucie? And why is it important on Port St. Lucie Boulevard? Well, what we know is the faster drivers are moving, the less drivers can see. So this slide illustrates the frame of view for drivers at different speeds. And at 40 miles an hour, you really can't look at the side street because you're going so quickly, your frame of reference has you focused 500 to 1,000 feet in front of your car. As traffic slows down, the view of the driver is broader. So if you're going 40 miles an hour, you never see those kids that are coming in from the sidewalk because they're not part of your focus. But if you're going 20 miles an hour, you can easily see what's happening on the side streets. So speeding has a relationship to safety and function of roadways. And it's a consideration that we have as we've analyzed the corridor. The other reason speed matters is that the faster drivers are moving, the less likely you are to survive an accident. So at 20 miles an hour, 10% of accidents tend to be fatal. But at 40 miles an hour, 90% of accidents are fatal. And so again, speed and the comfort with which drivers can move quickly or appropriate for the corridor has a direct relationship to the safety of our community and the quality of life that we get from our roadway, our transportation network. Why speed matters on this corridor is we have lots of kids, we have lots of users that are using the sidewalk on a regular basis, and they haven't been accommodated for with the roadway design that we have today. This was a typical Tuesday in January, so when I drove the corridor, almost every single stop sign was a de facto bike rack for kids that had gotten on the bus and gone to school that morning. And so what this slide communicates to me is a couple of things. We have a traveling public whose needs aren't accommodated, right? If you're chaining your bike to the stop sign, your needs haven't been accommodated in the traditional way that we would expect them to. The other thing I notice is they're not just a lot of bikes, they're bikes with training wheels being locked to the stop sign. So we're not gonna just have kids that are riding their bikes for the next year or two and then they're gonna age out. We have little kids and families that are moving into our community that have needs that we have an opportunity to improve. The other thing I love about this series of slides, if you look at that image it's to my left, that's a bench that was built by residents in the neighborhood. I'm told it's been there for more than 10 years. It was built with leftover wood. It's two different kinds of wood that are put together to make a bench. So there's so much demand to accommodate kids on the corridor. Somebody in their own garage went and built a bench. That it's been there for 10 years and gets used all the time is, again, just evidence of the demographic that we have along the corridor as we think about how to plan a better Port St. Lucie Boulevard. Pardon me. The city has done tremendous work in the last few years in understanding the role it has in making for better mobility. So if you're not aware already, the city has developed a mobility plan, which has been adopted. In fact, I think, Laura, there's a workshop tomorrow evening, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so the city's mobility plan looks at its transportation network and asks that question about complete streets. Are we accommodating all the users we have in our transportation network? And if we aren't, what are the kinds of improvements that we should implement to make for a safer, more connected, more accessible transportation network that makes us a more successful community? So the city's mobility plan identifies improvements for Port St. Lucie Boulevard, which is highlighted in green. Our segment is highlighted on the screen. And as many of you know, and we discussed a bit before the workshop, the roadway, of course, is going to be widened. In fact, widening is underway now. So I'll jump forward to that in just a moment. As part of the land use study, we of course looked at the existing future land use designations. What's helpful about this slide is it illustrates the corridor along Port St. Lucie Boulevard, if you can see it's kind of like in the darker peach color, is in an overlay zone where the city's already identified an opportunity for something other than single family residential. In fact, residential office type uses are envisioned along that corridor and regulated a little differently than the traditional single-family residential lots that lie to the interior. With respect to zoning, though, we know that most of the properties have a residential land use designation, and so there's an extra consideration necessary for them to go through that overlay process and become something other than single-family residential. We don't have a lot of vacant land left on the corridor, and that's a challenge for communities, not exclusive or unique for Port St. Lucie. It's a challenge that most of Florida's communities are dealing with, at least the ones in the Treasure Coast region, and that we really are out of land in the core part of our cities, and so redevelopment and infill development is much more difficult. It's a lot easier to build the perfect land use pattern when you have an open field. It's much more difficult to retrofit that pattern and find opportunities to make improvements. This slide illustrates the vacant parcels that are left on the corridor. I have a series of maps that details those as well, but we acknowledge in the planning study that we have to be very strategic in finding those sites that can be improved in a different way. Again, with respect to the roadway, of course, everyone can breathe the sigh of relief. The roadway is under construction. It's being expanded from 2 to 4 lanes. As we heard in the workshop, a strong need for us to have more roadway capacity. As the road is designed today, these series of slides illustrate the landscaping opportunities that exist along with the road. So as you can see, the city's already planning to have 2 11-foot travel lanes. As you can see, a fairly large median in the center. That median's about 14 feet. But then a fairly narrow landscape strip on either side, a 5-foot landscape strip with a fairly wide multi-use path. And so we generated some designs so we could get an idea of how that pieces together. In the landscape strip, the landscape median in the center is wide enough to accommodate shade trees, which is great. The landscape strips on the side, though, are a little bit narrow. And so in a 5-foot dimension, you can accommodate a palm tree or maybe a crepe myrtle. One of the considerations that we've suggested to the city is if we can, in some locations, widen that landscape strip just a little bit, we can accommodate larger shade trees. And those larger shade trees would help improve the appearance of the corridor and also provide more protection to the sidewalk, the multi-use path that exists on the side. Kind of an example of how that exists in plan. So existing condition, either palms or crepe myrtles. But again, that larger shade tree opportunity comes with a slightly wider landscape strip. You can really get a better feel for how that looks at the ground level. So at the ground level, there's the kid riding his skateboard who was riding it with it before the sidewalk was improved. Now he's on a multi-use path. So, and with either palm trees or crepe myrtles, there's some separation for that user on the sidewalk. But with a larger tree species, it's really game-changing. So it's a little strategic intervention that creates a very different yield from the user's experience. The road still can travel just as fast, but a 10-foot multi-use path with limited landscaping isn't always as effective and desirable as maybe a slightly narrower path that's really well shaded. So this is a suggestion just to offer to you as a community to get feedback from you about whether or not you think that's something the city should explore. So I'll take a moment of pause and have a drink because I want to be sure that we have a chance to answer questions from you guys and also just ask for Lauren to just see if there are any questions on Zoom. Keep going? Okay, I'll keep going. Yes, ma'am.
I think that's a great idea.
Okay.
I love it.
Okay.
And I just have a quick question.
So I'm just, for the group who couldn't hear Millie's comments, so Millie thinks larger shade trees are a great idea, so worth exploring, okay? I see Jeannie's giving a thumbs up also, so, okay. Yes, ma'am, you had a follow-up.
I was just going to ask if you were involved with the development on Becker Road.
Not directly. So we did a Becker Road plan several years ago, but not in the recent Becker Road improvements. Is there a question for the city with respect to Becker?
No, that's okay. It's just that I feel like Port St. Lucie Boulevard is going to be so much better than Becker Road.
Well, it really has an opportunity to transform along Port St. Lucie Boulevard. We did assist the city with an analysis at the intersection of Becker and PSL, and so At the close of the presentation, I will pull those slides up because I realize I omitted them from, it wasn't the focus for the presentation this evening, but since that question was raised, I don't want to not address that for you. So there's some specific suggestions about what to do at the intersection of Becker and PSL that really focus on building setbacks and the ability to retain locations for public art at the four corners. That's the welcome to Port St. Lucie moment, right? Becker and PSL, and it's the only road the city has named after itself. So it's a big deal. I mean, Port St. Lucie Boulevard is a significant roadway that leads to the People's House, right? It leads to City Hall. And so the significance of that corridor, the significance of the corridor and the importance of creating a statement and a welcoming moment on that corridor is an area where the City Council has spent a great bit of time trying to understand and negotiate with developers in that location to accommodate that. So I'll be sure to pull those images up afterwards, okay? All right, keep rolling. So when we think about completing the street, what are the tools in the toolbox that we have to complete the street? The tools are things like bulb outs and curb extensions to slow traffic as it enters neighborhoods. We have an opportunity to light crosswalks as well, raise or light crosswalks so folks are more visible at night. We, of course, can add landscaping, and the type and quantity of landscaping we add has a material effect on how comfortable it feels to drive quickly. And so that's a strong, again, consideration for the city with respect to how that corridor is built out over time. Street lighting, of course, adds an amenity to the corridor because it doesn't just light the corridor, it creates a branding opportunity and creates a sense of place. Transit shelters are on the horizon. The city's done a tremendous job in identifying an artistic transit shelter and theme that will be implemented through the city. So this corridor, again, is on the long-term plans for transit service. So ultimately, you'll see transit shelters like this one being installed. But a specific recommendation that came out of the process, in addition, is the idea of having pedestrian refuges. And one of the things we know is that we have a pretty good distance between lighted intersections along the corridor. So pedestrians are usually pretty comfortable walking a quarter to a half a mile. And after a quarter to a half a mile, people don't like to make that trip as often, and they tend to take shortcuts if there isn't an accommodation to allow them to make a safe crossing. On our corridor, we have 1.25 mile spacing between lighted intersections at the southern end. And so a way to accommodate pedestrian crossing along a corridor that's going to be a 4-lane corridor is to use a pedestrian refuge, or what's called a hawk signal, which is a high-intensity activated crosswalk. It acts like a lighted intersection, but it's just stopping the cars to allow the pedestrian to cross, and then the light turns green again, and the pedestrian can be accommodated in the median. There are 2 locations that we've identified for pedestrian refuge, and those are down at Gig and, Lauren, Gig and Macomb. Gig and Macomb. And those locations break the distance down into thirds, so you'd have no more than 1/3 of a mile ultimately between lighted crosswalk and pedestrian crosswalk. So this is a suggestion to the city to consider. FDOT, the Department of Transportation, is amenable to that, and the city is exploring the permitting that would be necessary to install those, if that's an idea that the public thinks is a good one to explore. So I see some nodding heads, so, okay. Moving on, yes, Lauren?
We do have a question online from Cheryl. She was, I'm assuming, talking about the street sections earlier. Doesn't look safe for cyclists to ride on the path and no bike lane.
Okay. And so the city's design does not include bike lanes on the corridor. Instead, bicyclists and pedestrians would both be accommodated in a multi-use path. There's a trade-off in the width of the multi-use path and the width of the landscaping strip. That's one that needs a lot of exploration. Fast-moving cyclists want either on-street bike lanes or wide multi-use paths. They don't tend to represent the bulk of riders who are out there. What we tend to find in many communities, and I think Port St. Lucie is reflective of this, is that riders are typically more recreational or more family-focused, and they're not as comfortable in the bike lane and want to be in their own facility. So again, with that multi-use path, an 8-foot wide sidewalk that's heavily landscaped with lots of shade. I'm sorry, it's not a sidewalk because it's too wide to be a sidewalk. It's an 8-foot wide multi-use path, is wide enough to accommodate recreational riders very comfortably, and offers an alternative to that, again, wider multi-use path that would have less landscaping and shade cover to it. But I appreciate that she raised that point. And that's definitely a design alternative the city's going to explore. So again, those mid-block crossings identified south of Parr, between Parr and Becker, to break the corridor down, make it safer for folks to cross in specific destinations. What we know, looking at human behavior, is that if you give people a defined place to cross, they tend to cross in that location if it's convenient and easy to get to. If we don't give that alternative, people cross wherever they can find a place to cross, and that creates for what tends to be a dangerous condition. And so we're trying to avoid that. Jumping down, the tour of the corridor. And so through the design process, we actually mapped out the corridor, all of the ownership on the corridor, and all of the existing buildings on the corridor today. So these maps illustrate a figure ground that takes us from Gatlin Boulevard all the way down to Becker Road. And as part of that process, we identified all of the opportunities that were reasonable to consider for some type of improvement. And so from Gatlin to the E5 canal, we don't really have a lot of vacant land to work with. And so identifying properties that have landscape deficiency is the best way to improve that corridor. If there's a property and the landscaping is deficient, the city has the ability to work with that owner. Keep Port St. Lucie Beautiful is a great partner to help private property owners that have commercial property bring their projects back up to code. So that's kind of really the extent of the likely improvement in that section. But as you get south on the corridor, there are lots of opportunities that were identified through the process for different types of aesthetic enhancement and beautification along the corridor. For example, the E5 canal, and I'll go into detail about these, but I wanted to give you the overview as we start to tour the plan. Those parcels in pink are the parcels that have common ownership of more than half an acre. Those are the infill development opportunities. We tested a development scenario using parcel A down there at the bottom of the slide, and then parcels B and C across the street. Those are up near Darwin Boulevard, just north of Darwin Boulevard, pardon me, where we have opportunities to expand stormwater through the city's acquisition are identified in green. There are methods the city can use to acquire property and improve it for stormwater and passive park use at the same time. While there's a cost to that, there's a net stormwater benefit that's gained, and that stormwater benefit can be sold or exchanged with a private property owner as well. And so I'll describe that scenario in just a moment. As we get further south down the corridor, again, there are a series of modest infill development sites, 2 acres and smaller. The mid-block crossing locations identified in those red circles down near Macomb and Gig near the school. And then an opportunity for a significant improvement at the intersection with Becker Road. So I'll go into the details of those, but we do have a broad view perspective as well. So the first category is ways to get more out of stormwater properties, okay? As we tour the corridor, the canal banks and the banks for stormwater conveyance, ditches and canals, are city-owned parcels that serve a very important function in the city. So we don't want to suggest anything that would compromise the function of getting stormwater out of the roadway and into, ultimately, its destination, which is the river, right? And cleaning it along the way. So there's nothing that we want to suggest that would compromise that. However, if there's a way for those properties to do more than just that purpose, that's an opportunity. And so along the corridor, as you guys know, because you live there, there are stormwater banks that when you're a designer like me, you think, gosh, that's a publicly owned parcel, and it could be something more than just a stormwater bank. So for example, cities use stormwater in improvements in lots of different ways. It's not just a canal that takes water to its destination, but there are some communities that use bioswales to make stormwater parks. Rain gardens, which by the way, add stormwater treatment as part of the process. So it's not just an aesthetic improvement, it's a functional aesthetic improvement that cleans the stormwater as it enters into the stormwater system. Pardon me. A canal bank can become a higher performing public space, right? If you add a shared use pathway, for example, along a canal bank. You can also add fitness stations and fitness trails along those banks as well. And so as we tour the corridor, starting at the E5 canal, which is the northernmost canal, today's condition looks like this. These are actually pictures I took from my car. And so east and west of the corridor, it's the largest bank, it's the largest canal, and again, it plays an extremely important purpose in moving stormwater out of our district. So we don't want to do anything that would compromise that. But in addition to just performing that function, there's an opportunity to add a multi-use pathway. And so as we look at the corridor from the air, if you imagine, if you start at, I do not have a mouse here, right, Albie? Can I use a mouse here? Great, thank you so much. So if you start at the intersection with PSL Blvd, thank you so much. No, mouse is better because folks on the online can see. So if you start at the E5 canal, you can actually bring a trail facility down along the bank, along the now vacant, but ultimately likely will be developed property that's just behind Simpatico Plaza. You could come along the drainage canal and cut back into Darwin and bring a trail all the way down to the edge of another stormwater pond, which is over here across from the gym. You create about a 1.8-mile trail facility, which is kind of a nice improvement to have in a city. We know in the city surveys, residents are asking loudly for more recreational facilities and more places where they can walk to go do things. And so this is an idea that we think is one that the city may wish to explore. To get an idea of what that might look like, here's the today condition. This owner, the private owner at Simpatico Plaza, is willing to work with the city on the idea of having an easement along the edge of this wall. The masonry wall is on their property, and they actually own the 20 feet that extends on the other side of the wall. Doesn't really serve much of a purpose for them. So a today condition looks like this. A tomorrow condition, could have some different features. There's an opportunity to add some landscaping. There's the ability to add a multi-use pathway, to add to the city's pathway network. There could be fitness facilities along the inside of that as well. Again, so long as we don't compromise the function of the canal, an opportunity found, we would suggest, for the city to consider. There's another opportunity for that down at the E84. That's the next big canal. The E84 is a little further south on the corridor. So again, a fairly broad bank. Existing condition, it's very functional, but not as attractive as it could be. So opportunity to add some appropriate landscaping that can survive well in that location, as long as it doesn't interfere with mowing along the corridor, and you can create an aesthetic improvement out of a facility and get kind of more out of your stormwater assets, if you will. Again, just concepts that are still being worked out, but some ideas to consider. Third example, a little smaller. We have some smaller ditches that are along the corridor as well. Existing condition, this one happens to be down by Rice. Tomorrow condition, again, just a little bit of landscaping and a little bit of love, and you can create amenities along the corridor that we don't have today. So some ideas on stormwater. The city's staff has been reviewing those concepts to make sure that they don't go too far. But if you like those are ideas the city might want to pursue. Okay?
I'd like to say something.
Yes, sir.
Down right here, down off of Port St. Lucie, right where St. Thomas is, they built a trail right by the water.
Sir, I can't hear you so well, so we're going to bring the mic back. That's
I'm
Ed, right?
coming right down there to you. We are more than happy to hear you. Go ahead, sir. I'm so sorry, but could you please repeat your question?
Okay, right down here, down in Port St. Lucie, right by McDonald's, they built a trail right by the water.
Uh-huh.
As I drive by there, to me, I think of it as a desert. If you go out on that thing, there's no shade whatsoever covering this thing, I think spots like that should be added, so you could go out and stroll and say, wait a minute, let's go hide under the shade here.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
So the idea of adding tree canopy is a priority the city has. that heat island effect actually is measured now on a national basis because there's a heat equity, shade equity conversation that happens in communities. So that's a great point that you make. And that's the type of thing that we think seems like an opportunity for the city, where we can add more trees to give us canopy. We have the ability to reduce heat impacts, and that has a beneficial effect, not just from an aesthetic standpoint. Man, it looks nicer to have trees along an edge. Why wouldn't we do that? But it also makes our sidewalks and our multi-use paths a lot more functional, so you can get out of the sun for a couple of minutes. So thanks for raising that point. So questions online or keep going?
There's a question online. What are the major intersections near each of those canals?
The major intersections by those canals. So the major intersection by the E5 canal is going to be Darwin. And as you can see, that trail takes you from, I know this one is illustrated, so that's why I wanted to show it to you. So this canal runs from just north of Darwin, and the trail idea would take you kind of through that property back over here to Belmont. So that's the idea with that one. And the E84 canal, Lauren, I think is down near Macomb? Jingle, thank you, Jingle. Southeast of Jingle, if I remember correctly. Southeast Jingle is the other major canal. But we actually have these canals and ditches all along the corridor. And so if this is an idea that you guys think is worth pursuing, the city has, I think, 11 different canals and ditches that intersect the corridor between Gatlin and Becker. And so different scales of improvement might be appropriate there, but nonetheless, if there are ideas that you think are worth pursuing, that's something the city can pursue. Okay? All righty, keep rolling. Questions from you guys? No? Okay, keep rolling. Land development considerations, okay, a little trickier. Now, a couple of ideas just to put in mind as we get into the conversation. Nearly 30% of all developed areas are roadways. And the roadway is always a community's front door, okay? So whenever you're going home, the roadway is your driveway because it brings you to your front door. So an idea to consider. There's a relationship between street width and building height. That's an architectural axiom, if you will. And the ideal relationship is a 1-to-1 to a 1-to-3 relationship. I'll give you an example of what that looks like. So 1 degree of height to 3 degrees of width is the ideal relationship from an architectural standpoint to enable a street to feel comfortable for pedestrians. That's kind of the measure. Okay, so 1 to 3, and this is typically like a downtown condition. So if you've ever been to somewhere like downtown Stewart, for example, downtown Stewart is actually a 1-to-3 ratio on Osceola Street. 1 increment of building height to 1 increment of height to 3 increments of width. As we fall away from that ratio, we end up with locations that don't feel as comfortable for pedestrians. What's different about these two things, other than the landscaping and other than the buildings? If we're on Port St. Lucie Boulevard and we don't want it to be Port St. Lucie Speedway, or we're on Alcantara or Jingle or one of our side streets, if we make it comfortable for drivers to go quickly, they tend to. There's nothing about facilities that have very broad widths with limited height that tends to tell drivers you should behave differently. In this condition, where we have a wide open space, it feels comfortable to go quickly. And so people tend to, regardless of what it says on the speed limit sign, you know, if the speed limit says 25 or the speed limit says 55, what drivers tend to do is drive as quickly as it feels comfortable, right? So the way we break down facilities like that is add landscaping, like for example, the shade trees that we talked about. Large shade trees try to bring that space in so it doesn't feel as comfortable to go as quickly. So building location does that also. So those are the elements that we can use to maintain our best height to width ratio. Okay, so that's just something to keep in mind. Pardon me. An example, this happens to be City Place. City Place, or now it's called Rosemary Square, if you've been down to that location. City Place, well, Macy's was still there, and there's a new building that's coming in now, but nonetheless, it has a 1 to 1.5 ratio. If you start to spread that out and you make it a 1-to-5 ratio, it's not as comfortable for the pedestrian. The cars feel more comfortable going quickly. If you give it a 1-to-10 ratio, it completely changes the character of the place. So again, that's an axiom just to put in your minds, if you will. And then back to its existing condition. So height to width ratio, a factor to consider. The other thing to think about as we talk about redevelopment examples is the idea of building frontage. And so in architecture and in town planning, what we try to accomplish are conditions where building fronts face building fronts. Your front door is across the street from a front door. That's the ideal relationship between buildings. And so the example on the left-hand side, we have a front-to-front relationship. What we try to avoid is a front-to-back relationship, right? When you come out of your front door, you don't want to look at the back of somebody's house, typically, or the back of somebody's shopping center, because all the stuff that you don't want to see is what takes place in the back, right? That's where the dumpster is, that's where deliveries take place. The backyard of someone's home is a private space, and so you really don't tend to want eyes on that space, okay? So front-to-front relationship, good relationship. Front-to-back relationship, the kind of thing we try to avoid in planning, okay? So I want to put these ideas in your mind as we talk about some examples of infill to consider. We have a new townhouse project that's been approved and is going through the final stages, and so we use that as an example to test the city's code to understand how's the code performing. Okay? And so, for example, there's a new townhouse project that was approved that's on I can't read my slide, Yamada, so the southern end of the corridor. It's going to be an 11-unit townhouse project, and so this is a site plan that's approved already, meets the city's code. This is 11 townhouses coming in on 1.05 acres, so it has 11 units per acre, permitted by the city's code. It has 11 townhouses that have a varying size from 950 to 1,250 square feet. Each one's going to have a one-car garage. Thank goodness, you think, if you think about the city's portfolio of residential uses, geez, we really need townhouses because I'd like my kid to come home from college and have a place to live, or my parents that have lived in their house for 30 years can't mow the yard anymore. I really want them to stay in the neighborhood, but there's nowhere for them to go. So if you think about it from that perspective, it's really, in some ways, it's a use that perfectly meets that need of diversifying the housing stock. The project has 25 total parking spaces, and all the stormwater is handled on site. So everything is built per the code. But if you think about arranging the site a little differently, and it's not a suggestion for this property in particular, just as a test to think about some of those axioms, right? Some of those principles. If you were to create a scenario where the building fronts were actually going to face the other building fronts, like in this scenario, I should point out, the building fronts face each other across the driveway that comes in from the street. There's one point of access. There's a 6-foot fence or wall that will be constructed along the adjacent property line. And because these buildings face each other, the back of these buildings is considered the roadway frontage. So these homes, which have their front doors onto the street, will be across from the back doors of the townhouses that will be constructed, okay? And to create a separation, there's a 50-foot setback and a 6-foot masonry wall that will be constructed because the code requires a separation between those uses. The stormwater for the site is located in that setback area. So you can see the green on the site is a detention area, okay, which is going to handle the stormwater on the site. Building fronts, they face each other. Building fronts, building backs. We have a conflict in the building frontage relationship, if you will. A different way to think about a site like this one, again, theoretically, just for food for thought, is perhaps considering a scenario where we would turn those buildings around. So if you turned those buildings around and you put the front doors of those buildings on the street, facing the front doors of the buildings across the street, you wouldn't need the 6-foot masonry wall in that instance. You'd put in a garden wall, a lower wall that's kind of a more appropriate wall for a residential neighborhood in this instance. You can still handle all the stormwater on site, but if you turn those buildings around, you'd put the stormwater in the middle. And by doing that, actually, and shrinking those setbacks a little bit to make them 25 feet, which is the front setback requirement, because you'd call this road a front, the building front would be along the roadway, you actually get a larger retention area. So you actually treat more stormwater on the site in a more efficient manner, right? Because in this scenario, you have a long, skinny drainage retention area, which doesn't perform as well as a wider drainage retention area could. In an alternative design, again, just food for thought, if this was an idea to explore, same number of townhouses, you have 11. Same number of parking spaces, you'd have 25. Same amount of stormwater being treated on site. These townhouses actually are a little bigger because we were able to fit slightly larger townhouses. So these are all 1,200 square feet instead of that smaller range. They all have one-car garages. It's an opportunity to explore, we would suggest. What do you get that's different out of a site like that? Well, building front doors face building front doors across the street. The stormwater is actually larger, so you get more stormwater quality. A garden wall would be the appropriate treatment instead of a masonry wall. And otherwise, you have really kind of an equivalent relationship as to the performance, if you will, of that site. A couple of examples of how that looks from the sidewalk. Okay, so if you're driving down the street, the standard code would require a treatment that looks like this. There's the 6-foot masonry wall. She's about 5.5 feet tall. So the landscaping happens on the other side of that wall, by the way. A little bit of landscaping perhaps can be installed on the outside, but there's not a lot of depth there. And then from the sidewalk, as you walk around the sidewalk, you're facing the backyard of somebody's house around that experience. An alternative, again, if we flip those buildings around, that masonry wall wouldn't happen. You'd have, if you had a wall at all, you could put a garden wall in along the edge. And the front doors of those homes, well, you'd have sidewalk connections that would come out to the sidewalk. The back of house takes place in the back of the house, on the inside of that lot, facing the back of house for the townhouses across the way. So another example of how that might look, again, here's the approved condition as you drive around the corner. So back of house and masonry wall facing the street, or front of house facing the street. So we wanted to test that, again, not to be critical of the approved project that meets the city's code, but to explore whether or not there might be a different way of doing things that could produce a better condition, okay? So with that in mind, we went ahead and tried to find a location where we could test these principles in a site that isn't developed yet. And so there's a relationship between 3 parcels on the corridor. Whoops, let me go back, and they are the parcel here at the, within the red square, parcel number 1, 2, and 3. And again, this is just a theoretical test. There's no proposal embedded in any of these illustrations. They're for the purpose of illustrating ideas, to see whether or not they're ideas that we think are worth exploring as a community. So the sites that we tested, sites A, B, and C. Doesn't matter who owns them, right? Because this is just all in theory, okay? And so we tested the city's code to understand what could you build on site A, for example. Site A is 1.91 acres, and the city's code would allow you to get to 21 units, 21 townhouses. Pardon me, that would stay below the density. If you develop that site to its maximum ability. It's not a very comfortable site. We wouldn't suggest as planners this is a very desirable condition. It's a bit tight. So we actually tested it with a slightly lower density to get an idea as to whether or not this might be something the city would want to pursue. And so this site A concept, illustrates what would be 18 townhouses, which is less than the permitted density. It's only 9 units an acre. Remember, the first one was 11 units an acre, if you recall. And so at 9 units an acre, you could theoretically, if you adjusted a few things in the code, allow a pattern of development like this versus one that would put its back to the street. So for example, in this design, common access from, again, the center side street. So you don't have, let me just jump back for a moment, just to make a point. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 single-family lots, which could be 8 driveways connecting to this street and 8 driveways connecting to the interior street. So I should point out, that's kind of the default condition. 8 single-family lots is permitted by right. No one takes that away in anything that they draw or suggest, okay? So that's kind of the default condition. The alternative condition, though, if this is an idea worth pursuing, so instead of 8 units, it's 18 units under the allowable density. Instead of 8 driveways connecting to the street, there are 2 driveways that connect to the street. None of them connect to Port St. Lucie Boulevard. They only connect to the side street and the interior street. All of the stormwater can be accommodated on site. The difference between this plan and what's permitted in the code is that this plan is designed with the building fronts facing the interior street. Okay, so fronts are facing fronts. In doing so, the setback is narrowed from 25 feet, from 50 feet to 25 feet to turn those buildings around, to allow them to meet the street in that location. So that's the big change. This concept as an idea would enable the development of 1,200 square foot 18 townhomes. They could either have 2 cars of covered parking, or they could have 2-car garages. We happen to illustrate them as covered, but they could be 2-car garages. They are accessed from the interior, so the backs of those buildings face the backs of the buildings across the parking area, and the fronts of those buildings front the 2 streets. So building fronts front the street to the rear, and building fronts front Port St. Lucie Boulevard. The open space for the site is accommodated in a few locations. There are open spaces at either end, and then there's a fairly large open space along Port St. Lucie Boulevard that creates a bit of a promenade or a setback for those townhouses. Again, just as an example, 42 parking spaces are required by code, 42 parking spaces provided in this concept, and all the stormwater is handled on site. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. To enable all the stormwater to be handled on site, some of these areas have stormwater retention in them. So they're not as functional for these residents as they could otherwise be, right? It accomplishes the stormwater function, but it doesn't accomplish all the functions that open space on a site could. For example, you can't go out there and throw a ball, right? If it's water, it has water in it. You're probably not going to go walk your dog through if there's stormwater there today, okay? So that's a consideration to keep in mind. It can be done, but it could also be done a little better, okay? So as some example. So how would a site like that look and feel along Port St. Lucie Boulevard? Is this something that we would like to see? Well, this is a scale model to illustrate what a townhouse project like that could look like. Here's Port St. Lucie Boulevard shown at its planned dimension. So these are our 2 11-foot travel lanes. 5-foot landscape strip. Again, the trees are a little smaller than they ideally could be, but we wanted to be able to illustrate. You'd have a garden wall along the edge, and townhouse fronts would be facing the front street. The interior of those houses would be facing, the backside of those houses would be facing each other. A couple examples of how that would look from a scale standpoint, potentially a design standpoint. There are probably 100 different ways to design a site like this one. This is just one for your consideration. So, so as you can see, back to back, front to front, 25-foot setback. You'd have sidewalks that would connect to the sidewalk inside the neighborhood. So an idea of what does a 25-foot setback look like? So this is a scaled representation of sidewalk on the interior street. You'd have maybe some type of garden wall along the edge, not a 6-foot high masonry wall because it's a front door. So maybe if you have a wall, maybe a 3.5-foot high little garden wall to create some separation. And then again, 25-foot setback, and then the fronts of those buildings. An idea of how that looks like maybe from the sidewalk. Okay, so that's one way to think about redeveloping sites, or really infill developing sites, in a manner it's a little variation from what the code would otherwise require, because what the code would tell you is you have to treat that interior street as the back. So the back of those townhouses and a 6-foot wall has to be along the interior neighborhood residential street. So this condition would be that one we illustrated, a 6-foot high wall and the back of houses facing that street. So a different way to arrange land development, for example, along the corridor. I have another example to use as well. We looked at the adjacent site, which is just under 1.2 acres. We tested the code to see what could fit, and in fact, what fits is 8 townhouse units. All of the stormwater would be located along the frontage of Port St. Lucie Boulevard. Not a bad thing, because stormwater accomplishes that function of retaining and cleaning stormwater. That's important. It also does create open space, but because it has a depression, it's not as functional as open space might be from a recreational standpoint, right? Because you're not going to walk through a retention pond or a retention area if it has water in it or it's a little marshy. But that said, can you build townhouses on one of these infill sites? In fact, you can. So this site also meets the city's code. Pardon me. It uses Port St. Lucie Boulevard as the front and has its 50-foot setback, actually, from Port St. Lucie Boulevard in this instance. The access from the access to the property, instead of 4 single-family lots with 4 single-family homes and 4 single-family driveways extending out to Port St. Lucie Boulevard, this instead internalizes that circulation, so it comes in from the side streets. In this instance, we have a back-to-side relationship because of the way the adjacent lots are developed, and so we do have a wall that's recommended between those two uses, and that is in compliance with the city's code. So an idea of what a scale model might look like for townhouses along those lines. So 8 townhouses, you can see kind of the first set of townhouses that were modeled adjacent to them over there to the right. This is, again, that retention area is all handled in the front of the property, and it makes a very nice open lawn, but it's not really a lawn in the most functional sense because it has stormwater needs that it has to accomplish. And so it's depressed and isn't always usable in the same way. By the way, Port St. Lucie Boulevard isn't going to 3 lanes. That's a turn lane on the roadway. We just forgot to drop the arrow in, just in case you were wondering. So, so that said, an idea of how those uses might feel from the sidewalk edge. They're 2-story buildings with landscaping along the street edges. From across the street, kind of what the scale of those buildings would look like. So, and then within the interior of that site, this is kind of the scale relationship that you'd have for those townhouses. Again, we have a back-to-side relationship, not as undesirable as a back-to-front relationship. That's the relationship you try to avoid the most. But we don't really have a choice in this instance, you know, as this site gets developed, because those homes exist already with a side relationship to the adjacent structures. And so to accommodate that development program on the townhouse site, the site B, you'd have a 6-foot wall. You would have a full wall separating it. You have the room to put in some landscaping, and then an interior drive that gives you access to the rear of those townhouses that would otherwise be facing Port St. Lucie Boulevard. Now, what I mentioned to you, and I was trying to lead myself into this point, the stormwater can be accommodated on those sites if it must be accommodated on those sites. In a city that may want to have the variety of housing types and add a townhouse type, amen, we get a townhouse product to work if that's desirable. So, however, there are different ways to accommodate stormwater. It doesn't always have to be on the site that's being developed, because the city has done a tremendous job of advancing a stormwater master plan. And as part of that master plan, the city, all the property in the city is broken down into basins and then sub-basins. And so there's a relationship within a sub-basin where stormwater leaving from one property can actually be treated somewhere else in the basin, so that we still get the stormwater treatment that we're required to accomplish, but we can do it in a more efficient manner. The least efficient stormwater treatment is on an individual basis where you have lots of little stormwater ditches and ponds on lots of different properties, because they're just not able to treat as much stormwater as efficiently as larger facilities can. Larger facilities also get the benefit of usually looking a lot better, right? Because you have enough depth to actually have water in them, and you have enough bank to have plantings to really make a stormwater facility look and feel more like a park, even though really its primary function is stormwater. And so in this example, we tested the ability to accommodate some of that stormwater off-site if we wanted to. This would take an investment by the city. Somebody would have to acquire the property. The city has a stormwater utility that can do that. There are grant funds available to assist cities that are creating common stormwater facilities. So there's a way to get there if this is desirable. So that said, on site C across the street, what we find is vacant assembled property that's alongside a drainage canal. What a nice efficiency. If you want to create a stormwater improvement, and you can do that adjacent to a stormwater canal, well, now you just got 1 + 1 = 3 or 4 or 5, because you have a better functioning canal as well as a stormwater improvement taking place in kind of in that same geography. So that said, we went ahead and tested to see whether or not, again, if this is a desirable idea, what might that look like? So for example, what you can see in this plan view is where you might want to create stormwater improvements. These could be small ponds, right? They're depressed areas that have the appropriate banks to allow stormwater to be treated moving through what's called the littoral zone. So you can have appropriate stormwater plants to help clean that stormwater before it gets into the pond and ultimately into the canal. By the way, these properties are all in the same basin. So if the city likes this type of approach, right, if you guys think it's a good idea for the city to pursue, the city can have stormwater improvements take place, for example, on properties like this, where that stormwater is happening nearby in the same basin, but not on the site. It's adjacent to the site in this example, and allow, as I mentioned, those public areas, those common open space areas, to be open space that might be a little more functional than stormwater, okay, on those sites where residents would be. So, examples of what that might look and feel. By the way, it's also an opportunity to introduce some beautification on the corridor, because remember, the default condition for properties like this, they're all single-family residential lots, so they could all be single-family residential with, I think this is 9 single-family lots with 9 single-family driveways. That's the default scenario. So instead of that, if it's desirable, those properties could look something like this. There could be an acquisition of all or some of those parcels for the purpose of creating stormwater improvement. That stormwater improvement can take place adjacent to the drainage canal, and then you still have some leftover land that you can use to make some beautification happen. Like, for example, a bioswale or a rain garden along the edge. You can expand the city's multi-use network and create some pathways in there. You could have some kiosks, some benches, lighting, landscaping, a place to get out of the heat a little bit, and create a neighborhood amenity. So again, examples of what this might look like if this is desirable. Some street level views. By the way, just to give you kind of a scale relationship, those townhouses that we talked about earlier, well, those would be those ones across the street, okay? So that's kind of the scale of what infill townhouse might look like, and then stormwater improvement really functioning as a city park in many ways. It's a stormwater park happening across the street. Couple of examples of what that might look like. This is drawn with the 5-foot landscape strip. Notice these trees are a little small. They're great to have trees, but they're not the bigger trees that we illustrated earlier. But decorative lighting with banners, the 10-foot multi-use path, and again, across the street, the townhouses. Now, I should mention, we did not draw in the landscape median in this location because you couldn't see the buildings across the street, but you'd actually have a landscape median through much of this section of the corridor. Okay, thoughts on that type of infill pattern? Does that feel comfortable? Does that seem crazy? Is it something the city should pursue? Is it something the city should run from? What do you guys think? We haven't had a chance to talk to the public about this yet. Millie.
I think that the city of Port St. Lucie.
Hang on, Millie. The microphone's coming back to you.
I would run, but ma'am, my shoes are sore today.
This is Laura's workout for tonight. What Laura's doing is she's taking the mic back, grabbing a cookie to fuel up, and coming back this way. So
This nice young lady, if you could say your name and your question, please.
My name is Millie. I think Port St. Lucie, the city should just let you be in charge and go with everything you have suggested so far.
So, well, we've had a lot of input from your staff.
I'm sorry, could you say that one more time?
It's everything you have mentioned and talked about is excellent,
Well,
really excellent.
well, it's really compliments to your staff because your staff has been in the leadership position in all of these discussions. So I appreciate that, though. Thank you. That's very kind. I wear a dark suit in case people throw rotten fruit. I never know what's going to happen.
Oh, we got more fans. Hold on, I'm going around. Name and question.
My name is Jeannie, or Gigi. The concept with on the townhomes with that big hidden wall, I can tell you from experience, like in West Palm and certain cities, I used to work in law enforcement, that's not a good thing to have. There's a lot of activity that goes on behind a hidden wall. I love the alternative concept that you have come up with. And I agree with Millie, because it looks like you have driven around our city, you have looked at our city, you have pretended like you live in our city, and you've got the ideas that need to happen. That's what we want, you know? So thank you.
Great feedback. So,
Yeah, thank you.
Lauren does live in the city, actually, so she drives it every single day. I only get to drive it a few days a week when I'm up here working, so thank you for that. Other thoughts, questions? Anybody think it's crazy? Does anyone think it's a crazy idea? Because we want to know that. I mean, the compliments are wonderful, but the criticism is even more valuable sometimes to make sure that we're on the right path. So, we're okay? All right. Lauren, any questions from the Zoom room? So, all right. Keep going, guys? Keep going. I'll keep going. Okay, great. Another idea that we think is one the city might want to consider is the idea of working towards a better tree canopy. Okay, it's not getting any cooler in Florida. I don't know if you've noticed, but the winters are harsher and the summers are even harsher than that. So tree canopy is identified as a primary way to mitigate heat impacts. Right? This is not Kim's idea. This is pretty basic science. So, the city looks pretty green. If you fly over the city in a plane, it looks greener than it actually functionally is, okay? But it feels like we have a lot of trees until we really get into analysis of the city, okay? And actually, there's a group that does that. There's a tree equity group that looks at the United States for tree equity and canopy coverage. And their website is available. It's treeequityscore.org. So it happens to be a nonprofit that looks at tree equity as a factor of equity and livability. Okay, and so for example, you can type in Port St. Lucie and you get an image like this. And from a larger scale view, again, the city seems pretty green, right? But as we zoom in, right, if we look at St. Lucie County, which is mostly undeveloped, it has a fairly high tree equity score, again, because it's mostly undeveloped. Pardon me, so we're at like an 88 out of 100. When you get into the city, certainly the city is more developed than the county, right? So when we zoom into the city, overall, at the aggregate level, we have a tree equity score of about a 70, citywide. But again, the city is actually mostly undeveloped as well, right? We have a lot of vacant land out west, and that's kind of counting into our tree equity score. As we zoom into our Port St. Lucie Boulevard corridor study area, which is the area that you see here, we drop down a whole lot. We're down to about a 48 in total tree equity on the measure that's established. So whether or not you think it's a valid measure, it's at least valid to think about it in perspective versus those other geographies that are being analyzed by their metrics, if you will. So nonetheless, we're down to a 48 score on our corridor. But in terms of tree canopy, our tree canopy is down to 28% of what's desirable. So, and this is not rocket science, right? In the citizen summits that the city's carried out, residents consistently over time have echoed, have conveyed strong concerns about the fact that the city is getting more developed, the city's losing its tree canopy, and the city should do the things it needs to either buy and hold land or add tree canopy back, because people miss that. So, so we know by these measures anyway, that concern people raise seems to be validated by scores like this one. It's hard to reintroduce tree canopy, right? We've talked a little bit about getting larger, more substantial trees in what would have to be wider landscape strips along roadways when we build them. That's one way of doing that. Pardon me. Requiring larger trees on installation for commercial properties is another way, okay? A third way, if we have all of the stormwater handled on every single property, you can't get big canopy trees to survive in a stormwater ditch, right? Because that tree species doesn't live there. So if we require stormwater treatment on every site, we reduce the amount of area where we can plant trees that can give us canopy. Or we can shift some of that stormwater treatment off-site and require developers plant large trees with a big canopy in those areas that we allow them to use as open space, right? So those are the kinds of things we can do as a city. They're not big moves for the most part, but they're meaningful moves if we make those things happen. We also have opportunities to add tree canopy to single-family residential lots. This illustrates a fairly new home that happens to be recently constructed along the corridor. What you can see is the driveway has been constructed in segments because, as we know, this road's going to be widened. So that driveway that's there today is going to be a lot shallower when the road is widened. So that's, the homes are being designed intentionally to enable that to happen. The city recently adopted a driveway standard that requires circular driveways on the road, right, which should make it safer. They are pretty wide though, right? So one side of that driveway is required to be, I think it's 32 feet wide. Lauren, is that right, that number? I think it's 32 feet wide on the main driveway in and up to 24 feet wide on the driveway coming out. So if you have an 80-foot lot, if you do the math, we're not left with a lot of area to plant trees if so much of that frontage is taken up by driveway, okay? The city does require 5 trees be installed on a single-family residential lot. Those trees can be installed in the front of the property, and what you notice is most of these new homes that are coming in have a single tree located in the center of the driveway, which is great, but there's an ability for the city to kind of move a little further in the tree canopy that's installed in front of those properties. There's the room to add more trees in the front of the single-family residential properties. And on corridors like Port St. Lucie Boulevard that are going to be widened, the city could require that, and it could actually help fund it through Keep Port St. Lucie Beautiful, directing it at this corridor with very specific tree types that will give us canopy back over time. And so this is an idea that is one that may be worth exploring, the idea of adding some requirements for new single-family residential, that there are locations for canopy trees in the front of those homes, and then actually taking a step further, and if needed, give away some of those trees to get the trees planted in the front of those properties. So again, not a big move, but could be a very meaningful move for the city, especially in a location where we have such a limited tree canopy and we're losing it as sites get developed. So just an idea for you to consider. We've gone ahead and identified different tree species types that are good types of trees that will give us that type of canopy. And so this is all part of the information for the city to consider. This will be all part of the city's implementation if it likes to go in this direction. But again, an idea that we think might be one that could be valuable to explore to add some tree canopy back. Any hesitation on that idea? Everybody think that's okay? We've got a question in the Zoom room.
Yes. Will this driveway impede on the sidewalk that peds and cyclists are supposed to use, like on Becker Drive?
So the answer to that question is yes. Every one of the driveways is going to intersect the multi-use path, which is unfortunate. But there's no way to get back to the street without going through the multi-use path. It's a point of awareness that we've taken on as designers when we look at the city's circular driveway requirement and the relationship between the width of those driveways and the width of the lot, because there's not a whole lot of land left that's not going to be driveway in that instance. And so that's a point of awareness that we have as designers, and we've raised it as a point of concern for the city to consider as it goes forward. Because again, those driveways are serving a very important function, right? They're getting cars out of the way of traffic. However, they're also creating some conflicts with the ability to safely use the multi-use path, because now you got all these driveways that are intersecting the path. So the path isn't really as utilitarian. So the answer to that question, and I'm glad it was raised, is yes, it will affect it. Other questions about the driveway thing, Millie? You might need to run the mic back there.
Millie, just yell at me anymore. We're friends at this point.
She can just throw the mic back there. I think Ed can catch.
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead and take it.
It's not so much about the driveway, because we have the same problem on Becker Road. Now it's terrible. But in reference to the trees, I've noticed that new houses that are being built, first thing the homeowner does, ditch the trees.
Yeah.
And then the ones that don't take care of them anyway. So it's almost futile.
Yeah, it's so that's a condition that we've chatted with your planning staff about as well, because the requirement is that you have those trees when you get your CO, and then once you have your CO, you know, whatever happens, happens. And so there's a larger scale program that really deals with neighborhood stabilization and kind of beautification and ownership that might be appropriate. And that's one of the ideas. The city's already doing a tremendous job with the neighborhood outreach program. It's one of the only cities that has as extensive a program as it does. But there's some community building that's necessary sometimes for other homeowners to buy in. And my sense in being out on the corridor is that, you know, because the corridor hasn't had the level of attention, for example, that other corridors have had, there isn't as aggressive an amount of maintenance and investment that you see. We see that in communities all over. It's not exclusive or unique to Port St. Lucie. So as the corridor is improved, you know, there's an opportunity to kind of reach out on the city's part to maybe reintroduce some of those trees, and that's what we've illustrated. You know, if this is an idea that makes sense and there's neighborhood buy-in, that's great. But there might be some work necessary in getting that buy-in to happen. So governance is not easy. Governance is really hard.
We live just behind Becker Road.
You have to eat the mic. Sorry. That's what they always tell me. I got to eat the mic.
And, you know, there was a day I used to walk all the time. I'd walk down Becker Road, and if there was a branch that was hanging over the sidewalk, I would call and say, could you trim the tree? Oh, they didn't want to do that. God forbid they should trim this tree. We don't want to lose these trees. The whole road is completely barren of trees. Completely.
Yeah.
The sidewalk goes from the curb to the house's front lawns. We have mailmen driving down the sidewalk. We have people parking on the sidewalk. And it would be wonderful to prevent that from happening on Port St. Lucie Boulevard.
Yep. We hear you.
Trees is an excellent idea.
Okay. Well, we've got that jotted down in the notes.
Thank you, ma'am.
Other thoughts on the tree infill opportunity? Good idea. Keep going.
Don't they have gigantic trees up north that grow in the water?
There are some species that can survive. It is cypress trees. Cypress trees can survive. They drop their leaves, though, so they don't give us a consistent canopy. It's what I would suggest to you is it's much harder to get good canopy conditions in stormwater environments. It's much easier to get good canopy in dry environments. So we can do it, right? We can get trees to live in a stormwater environment, but if you think about the marsh, you know, we don't have that kind of coverage like that and that flow that makes for a healthy condition for those drought-tolerant species. They're not as robust. So that's why they're thin. They don't have a lot of leaves on them. And again, they don't give us that type of canopy that people think about when they think about canopy in a city or canopy along a roadway. It's a different tree species. It's more like a buttonwood or a live oak that gives us that more consistent greening that people tend to look for. And again, that plays into that relationship in stormwater. Stormwater is very important. It's paramount. We don't want flooding and we don't want dirty water going in the river. Those are the top priorities for stormwater. So if we can accomplish those things, though, in a smarter or different way, then we might be able to get other things to happen as well. Like, for example, you know, trees that want to be big and full of a canopy because they're not sitting in, their roots aren't in water, you know, 6 days out of 7 or whatever. So, okay.
Excellent comments.
I don't need the mic, I have a big.
Use your playground voice. That's what I do. I can get all the way across the
We
playground.
got to let the other folks hear you, though, ma'am.
When the builders are doing the homes, I mean, does the city require before that house, you know, starts to be under contract, it's done, do the trees have to be there at that point in time? Or can they not wait, make that one of the options? Whoever, okay, Sally comes in, she's buying that home. Joe comes in, he's buying that home. Now they can pick the 5 trees they want to do instead of making it mandatory, boom, just put trees there right now.
Yeah, well,
They do, they pull them up and they throw them away. They
So-
want fruit trees.
pardon me, the trees are required to get the CO. So, but then once it moves into the homeowner's domain, those trees don't have to be maintained because you have a requirement to have trees anywhere on your lot. So the trees that count towards that requirement can be the trees in the backyard, which are also important. But again, they don't provide the same function that canopy trees in the front yard do, right?
I
So,
don't think it delayed the process until, the home was sold, and then put the trees in there.
The question was, she wasn't sure if they could delay the process.
yeah. So, okay, keep rolling. Make the most of city holdings. This is really our last point. So, and thank you, by the way, for your patience. It's been very nice to have a conversation with you. It's nice in a workshop format to be able to do that. So we appreciate your grace in communicating with us because it gets lonely up here. So that said, make the most of city holdings is our last big point and big idea to explore. We don't have a lot of land on this corridor. We have a few locations where the city owns property. And each of those locations, we would suggest to you, should be milked to its greatest ability to provide a sense of place, some recreation, stormwater treatment if we can do it, right? And help add to the brand and the importance, really, of Port St. Lucie Boulevard as an important corridor. The city owns a parcel at the corner of Macomb and PSL. It happens to be adjacent to a canal. Amen, because that means that site can perform a higher stormwater function as well as a beautification opportunity. An example of the kinds of improvements that you may want to consider as a community. Here's the before condition. It has green, which is a priority, and it does have trees, and that's great. But it's also a location where 10 minutes before this picture, there was a bike chained to the stop sign, right, because of the way the neighborhood functions. So here's the before picture. And here's an after concept. Pardon me. With some thoughtful design, a site like this one can become a stormwater park with a stormwater feature at the interior that has a rain garden planting along its banks, shade trees in the dry part of the site, a little neighborhood park opportunity, a place for kids to formally park their bikes in bike racks, right, where the buses are picking them up anyway. Maybe add a little public art along the edge to, again, create better identity along the corridor and a little piece of respite along an otherwise busy drive to home or work or when you're out walking your dog on the new multi-use path. There's another opportunity. So let me back up for a moment. Pardon me, those are the general ideas and recommendations that we have for the subject corridor, which is Gatlin to Becker, okay? In addition, though, as part of this effort, we were asked to also talk to the public in this workshop about another opportunity the city has along the lines of make the most of the city's holdings. So a little further north at the intersection of Port St. Lucie Boulevard and Floresta is a trio of city holdings, okay? So the city acquired some property to accommodate a turn lane from Port St. Lucie Boulevard onto Becker, and the city now owns 3 of the 4 corners. So the city owns the northwest quadrant, the southwest quadrant, and the northeast quadrant. The northeast quadrant is where you see a stormwater pond being constructed today. That stormwater pond is going to have some landscaping. There's going to be a city information sign at the front. There is no set of plans yet for how the city might want to improve the other quadrants, though. Okay, so the city owns the property across the street, and it owns the property now catty corner. There's a pretty good-sized remnant that was that's left after the city put a turn lane in. What we know is Floresta is going to have a shared use path constructed as part of that improvement. So you're going to have a shared use path along this roadway. The city owns the corner of Floresta and Penn. And so there's an opportunity to make some improvements there. And the city also owns the corner of Floresta and Essex, where there's a large stormwater pond. And the city's in the process of putting in a path around the lake, pardon me, and some fitness stations. So you have like a little fitness trail over there. So one of the questions the city wanted us to ask, since we had the good fortune of having the public join us in this conversation, is what do you guys think? Do you have any ideas about what might make sense on these other properties? So do we want to explore landscaping as a city in this location? That seems like it's a likely yes, based on the conversation that you've had so far. But do we want to explore landscaping? And should that landscaping be tree canopy? Should we do some stormwater treatment on the site and make a rain garden or a bioswale? You know, what might make sense to you guys as residents and homeowners in the city? Should we explore public art? That long, narrow piece, which is the southwest quadrant, is kind of a long, skinny, narrow piece that maybe that's a location where we could have some public art. You know, maybe you could do a sculpture garden or something like that. That's a little set back from the road. We don't have a lot of parking to get there. Parking is likely going to happen down the street a little bit. But Floresta is a shared use path where you're going to have probably a lot of folks riding bikes and walking. So this might be a location where something like a little sculpture garden could happen. The city has some big public art in a few locations, but there's also opportunity for some smaller, like quiet public art is what I call it, which is a little more intimate. There's the opportunity along the roadway edge to add some public amenities. Would it be beneficial to have a water fountain just for you or for you and Rover? Because there are different types of water fountains you can put in. Do we want to put in a solar charging tree? So you're on Floresta and you took too many selfies and now your cell phone's tapped out so you can actually plug in and charge in a solar charging tree. That we're seeing those come in the region as well. You might consider in some location a little bike repair station. That's another kind of typical piece of public infrastructure that we're seeing more and more in cities, especially along shared use paths, where you have a place where, geez, you know, I went over that branch and now I have to adjust my brakes. So it's actually a tree that has a bike pump and a couple of bike tools attached to it. So you can stop and put air in your tire or fix your brakes or whatever might need to happen along your journey. So these are the kinds of things that have come up in conversation. And you might have more ideas about things that might make sense. It's a busy intersection. It's a 6-lane section of PSL, meeting a pretty busy 2-lane Floresta. But that said, again, we're a city that doesn't have a lot of opportunities left to find places to, you know, make cool things happen that are really for the public. And so we didn't want to miss an opportunity to get your input on those ideas or maybe others that you might have. And you don't all have to give them all tonight. I mean, we'll be here all day. We'll be here, in fact, all year and forever, because we always work with the city. So you can always give us information later. But we wanted to throw that out there for you, okay? So with that, that's actually the end of my presentation slides. So what do you think? Are we crazy? Are we long on crazy? Or are we in an okay place on some of these ideas?
Which this side I haven't heard a whole lot from. No. I'll come back to you later.
Well, I happen to feel that art, you know, it's very, you know, relaxing, but it's very expensive. I mean, you can get things that now they're, and it's just, and I personally don't like modern art, so it doesn't thrill me. But I just say that's a great way to burn up money, just buying art stuff.
Yeah, well, the city does have an art in public places program that's funded through development. So there's actually a fund that's set aside in the city for the city to buy and showcase public art. It's not paid for by taxpayers. It's paid for by developers as part of a development fee. So that fund already exists. There would be a cost, for example, in creating a podium, like a cement slab, if you're going to bolt public art in a location. So there's that cost, but the cost of the art itself actually isn't a cost that is attributed to residents. It's paid for by the commercial private sector through the development process. Okay?
Oh, this gentleman.
This picture right here, I mean, it's nice looking at a path and thinking, okay, that'd be a great path to walk down. It would also be nice for people to run down.
Okay?
And I don't know about dogs, but I could see, yes, a fountain with a dog attachment is very important, you know, because
Sure.
But there's a lot of equipment that you have to worry about putting somewhere and it's stuff disappearing.
Right.
I know at Christmas time, they put generators by the poles and they tried to light up the poles. And then somebody now is lighting up the house or whatever they're doing with these generators because
Sure.
they're gone.
So that's why maybe some of the solar lights might be the right kind of fit, right? Because those are bolted into the ground, essentially into a slab, and they're permanent fixtures. So self-perpetuating. Okay, other thoughts?
Yeah, as far as the art goes, in the parks and along the trails, most cities very rarely have to pay to put art there. It's usually done through foundations, local art clubs, and offerings. Even local artists sometimes will temporarily put their artwork there to be shown. So I don't think that's a big expense. I think that's a benefit to the community. The other thing is a lot of cities now, with the aging society and to accommodate our handicapped residents, in addition to the solar-powered phone regeneration stations, have an electrified generation station. A lot of people use three-wheel handicapped scooters.
Yep.
And even now golf carts on a lot of the sidewalk and pathways that are 10 and 12 feet wide. Sometimes they run out of power.
Sure.
That would be a nice added benefit. We don't want our ADA compliant facilities and our folks running out of power on their units when they're out there enjoying the afternoon. So that might be something to consider as well as an
Okay.
add-on.
Yeah,
at key locations throughout.
So we, as we kicked ideas around at a staff level, we actually also thought about that EV charging idea, because it is a growing segment of the population is shifting towards electric vehicles, and there might be some spots that make sense, on one or more of these properties for a couple of EV spots, so that if you need to go get a charge, you can plug in and charge up, and then walk over to wherever that little sculpture garden is, have a moment to take a breath out of the busy day, and then you're charged up and able to go. So, and they can be fee-based, so there's not a cost to the city to do that, but it just creates opportunity to get a quick charge. So, Jeannie, you have any thoughts over there?
Sounds
No.
good. I like it.
Like it?
I thought on that one where it showed where you
Charging your phone. I
Yep.
saw the handicap placard, so I figured maybe there's something for a motorized cart, handicap cart or wheelchair,
Sure.
something like that too. So,
Okay,
yeah, I like that. That's good.
so, all right, cool. Other thoughts from the room? Yes, ma'am, in the back. Hang on for just a moment. I don't know that I can hear you so well.
Art would be bronze, like the art in tradition with the children, or the art in by Becker with the little children by the little water, or the one on US 1 over the Roosevelt.
It could be.
Yeah, they look so peaceful,
Yeah.
with children, bronze children. Even the new one that they put by Ocean Boulevard by the new cancer hospital, it's someone donated, but they look peaceful. And then the other tree that I was thinking about, I don't know if it sheds a lot, even though it grows big. We don't know how overgrown. The ficus tree.
Yeah,
I was
it's a little
thinking-
tricky with the ficus, with the,
It's a lot of leaves.
well, and also with the stormwater pipes, so.
Oh, okay,
you have
the
to be
roots.
Very careful with the
roots, okay.
Because those roots will come right in your house, so.
Well-
But yeah, it's a great looking tree when it's planted in an appropriate space, right?
True.
Ficus is really.
Like the one in
a-
the marina at Pima Vista. But like you said, are even the same ones that they have the Poinciana or something? Those are nice.
Royal Poincianas?
Yeah.
Yeah, with the red leaves, so, yeah, Florida native. The Florida Highwayman signature tree, the Royal Poinciana. So the Florida Highwaymen, it's like the signature tree that the highwaymen celebrate, or the big Poincianas. And that's a neat idea. Maybe this is a place for flowering trees, specifically flowering trees. And it's a little bit of a double-edged sword with the flowering trees. Like Stewart, for example, has tababoulias planted along East Ocean because Dr. Menninger, who was one of the original, the yellow ones, yeah. So identified that Stewart would be a flowering tree city. So the whole roadway is planted with tababoulias. They look great when they're blooming. They don't look as great when they're not blooming. And there's an in-between time when all of those blossoms drop. But if you had it in a green space, I mean, that's an idea to explore, right? Maybe you could have different flowering trees that bloom at different periods of time. So if you do it right, I've seen projects that have been designed where they have a tabebuia, a poinciana, a jacaranda. There's maybe 5 or 6 different flowering trees that spread about 8 months. So there always could be something in bloom in that location. An idea. Okay.
Got an orange one right now.
Okay, so that's a Royal Poinciana, probably orangey red, maybe, right? Okay, cool.
Let's take one more question, and I think maybe Lauren
And
has some.
Zimmerman.
So one more.
Oh, yeah. I would just like to expand on that. I think color is everything. I think ground cover and canopy, when you look at flowering, colors is most important to bring back a good feel, character of the community. I mean, here in Florida, a lot of people that travel down here and move here from the Northeast and the upper Midwest, they look to palm trees as their heaven on earth. But again, after a while, it does get a little boring.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the palm tree
And you don't get a lot of
canopy-
shade from those palm trees.
No, you do not. And birds have a difficult time also landing and making homes in the palm tree. So they look good on vacation brochures and everything else. When you live here, though, it's a little different. I think there needs to be a balance. And I think through the landscape department, if you look at good ground cover that gives maintenance-free color, I think that needs to be brought in along, like the young lady said over there, with flowering trees. It just makes people feel good. It brings out a good urban design and character, whatever kind of land you should put out there.
Right.
And again, keep the palm trees too. It is Florida, but it's not something that I think we have to go over. I mean, if you look at the highways and everywhere we're building now, palm trees are going up, but they don't provide the kind of character I think that we want to see.
Okay.
And, I think the tourism and the vacation issue is one thing. It brings in money, but again, a lot of people are moving here and they have to feel good, and I think color is everything, and we should look to that.
Yeah, gives good energy, right? And that mix of color. You have a mic there, Lauren?
On the ground cover, on the grass. But if it's in the asphalt, what a mess.
Okay.
She's just stating more ground covering for, I believe, stormwater retention.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
All right.
Got it.
Thank you, everybody. I really
Let's,
appreciate the comments. Let's
Jump
go
over
back to
this
Lauren.
room and find out what we have.
Okay, so we have a question from Melody. Do features like charging stations increase crime and/or loitering in the area?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we haven't seen that. What we have found where charging stations have gone in is they're used by people locally. And so, Port St. Lucie, like all cities, is focused on making sure we have a safe environment. We haven't found that to be a factor. They tend to be used by locals who know they're there because you have to know it's there to use it. So that tends to govern itself. Other questions?
And from Christina, is there a way to prevent the new homeowners that will build on PSL Boulevard to block the view of the cars turning from side streets onto the boulevard? Coming from Hoffenberg into the boulevard, I can't see past some of the cars parked in their own driveways.
Got it. So I guess that's a design. That's a bit of a design question that we'd need to explore. One of the things to think about, and I'm just going to jump back over to this image. Speaking about side streets in particular, and I didn't emphasize this point, but I want to be able to do that with you, is the use of, hang on for a second, side streets, just for food for thought for the group. You have a lot of speeding on side streets. People kind of are hustling pretty fast down PSL, using it as the PSL speedway. And then they kind of peel off the road and they fly down the side streets. And there's not a lot of messaging in the roadway design to make drivers do anything else. The speed limit sign is kind of like almost there as decoration sometimes, right? And so there are ways the city can mitigate speeding on side streets through design techniques. So the kinds of techniques, I want to just bring this point up because it kind of relates to that. So the design technique that we have found tends to work pretty well is using bulb outs and raised crosswalks and curb extensions like this one. Because if you make it easy for the driver to make that turn and go quickly, the driver tends to do that. I mean, people drive as fast as the road feels comfortable for you to drive on. So when you create interventions and you make it inconvenient for people to go fast, they don't tend to drive as fast. And P.S., you can't turn this corner going fast because you hit the curb. And so an idea to think about, those curb extensions are valuable. There's different ways you can arrange these on a street. They can be kind of mid-block. Those are called chicanes, where you kind of push that curb out a little bit, like partway down the road. So you have to slow down and get around the chicane. And it's a double-edged sword like everything else. There are some people who all they do is complain that you slowed them down. But there's often what we find in communities, a larger group of folks that say, thank God they slowed that road down because they were speeding past me and I wasn't comfortable. And so just, again, food for thought in terms of access and visibility and speeding. Of course, the landscaping needs to be planted appropriately so that the landscape material doesn't obscure the view for drivers. There's what's called a sight triangle that you actually utilize to make sure that you have very low ground cover or you have fairly high tree canopy. But there's nothing in that space in the middle that blocks the view of drivers, so you don't create a safety condition. Instead, you create the opposite. With good landscaping and design, you create a safer condition because now you have to slow down before you make that turn, either coming in or going out. Makes it a little safer. So I just wanted to mention that to you. Now, I'm going to ask Laura if you can give me a moment. I did want to, there were some questions about the intersection of Becker and Port St. Lucie Boulevard, and I don't want to not make good on my promise to add those slides back. In fact, they were in the presentation from the first workshop. Do we have that on your website? The first presentation, is that posted on the website, Avi? From workshop number 1? No. Okay, so I'm going to get a copy of the presentation pulled up so that I can use those slides just to help you bring you fully up to speed on all the ideas that have been kicked around. So, okay. So let me do that with my laptop there. Okay, and a jump drive.
While she gets that pulled up, I just wanted to read one of these online comments. We always appreciate people that have really positive things to say about the consultants' presentations and about the city, because we love the city as well. Cheryl wanted to say, great presentation. Love the idea of walkway and sculpture garden with tree canopy. Charging stations and bike utilities would be nice along multi-use paths. She says, thank you very much. I'm pretty sure she meant thank you very much, Dr. Delaney. But it sounds like we had a lot of fan of the art and the sculpture gardens. While Kim brings that up, did you all have any ideas, either online or in person? Anything that you had a preference to? Any one item in particular? Sculptures, landscaping, charging station, technology? What you got?
Onto Port St. Lucie, coming from the 95, and then you make a left onto it, and one lane merges right away, merges onto the left lane. Is that it?
I believe that is a graphic taken from somewhere else. That's a conceptualization of that would be nice, and that's part of the philosophy that the RPC was bringing up about complete streets and completing the street, bringing these streets safer for pedestrians. I'm sorry, what'd you say?
Eventually the traffic and the foot traffic and the sidewalk gonna build up as the time go on, coming from 95, making the left onto Port St. Lucie Boulevard from Becker. Yeah. So
All right, excellent comment. All right, see if Kim's ready. All righty.
My computer's very tired
While Kim's still bringing that up, I wanted to reiterate one of the images you saw earlier in Kim's presentation that hit home if you were not able to visit our first workshop, and that was the graphic of all the children that are currently using Port St. Lucie Boulevard South and the age of them. Yes, workshop number 1. And if you recall in that image, you could see the bicycles that were chained to any sign, any makeshift element that they could find. And that really brings to light, the importance of the users along that boulevard. So I didn't know if any of you were already aware that, that particular corridor was already, that was the need. I'm sorry, what did you say? Oh, that's your neighborhood, so you're intimately aware of it.
Quit moving the mouse. So, apologies. This is the first workshop that was presented back in January, and I wanted to. There were some questions that were raised earlier, and thank you, by the way, for all of the feedback. So, the only way to make good decisions as a city is to get feedback from the public. So, I know this council is really highly prioritizes getting feedback from the city through citizen summits and workshops, participation in person, by Zoom, writing comments. So just on behalf of the council, because we're really the council's representatives, thank you for making this time this evening. What I wanted to be able to illustrate for you is the, there we go. At the intersection, to Millie and Ed's question, actually before the workshop started, we talked a bit about the intersection of Port St. Lucie Boulevard and Becker Road. And the Regional Planning Council actually assisted the city about 10 years ago or so in an overlay zone for Becker Road that was developed as the city was annexing properties to the west and really starting to infill. And what that master plan identified was the importance of what happens at the intersection of Becker and Port St. Lucie Boulevard. You never have a second chance to make a first impression, right? And so if you're coming off I-95 or you're coming off the Turnpike or coming north from Martin County, that is the moment of arrival that you have as you enter the city. And as I suggested to you, there's only one road in the city that the city named after itself. It's that one, Port St. Lucie Boulevard, and it leads to City Hall. So in terms of significance, what that plan recommended and what the council has continued to suggest as we've assisted the city is the importance of doing something significant in that location. And so in the master plan that was adopted, pardon me, this slide picks up some of those concepts. You may well know the city is in the development process now for a series of commercial developments that will happen in that location. And so these concept plans were actually developed by one of the city's architectural consultants who took those private plans together and tried to assemble them into some concepts. And so the council assisted the city in illustrating what these corners could look like. And so, again, at that primary intersection, which is PSL and Becker, the city has control, really, over commercial development on all four corners because commercial development isn't permitted by right if it includes drive-through facilities, for example, and there are a number of users that want to put drive-through facilities or gas stations in those locations. They all require special permission from the city, which gives the city the ability to influence the design of those sites if it wants to allow those uses to happen. The city has decided that. There's a demand for additional gas. There's a demand for some of those drive-through uses, but how they land on the ground has the ability to provide a public purpose as well, which is creating that moment of arrival. And so this image illustrates a suggested pattern, which is similar to the one the city approved in this location, which is to carve out and set aside the four corners for public art and connect them to what will be the multi-use path along Port St. Lucie Boulevard when it's ultimately widened, and the existing path along Becker. In addition, though, along Becker Road, that sidewalk that exists today with a curb at the edge of the travel lane isn't as comfortable for all users as a sidewalk or pathway could be if it was set back a bit. And so the recommendation to the city was don't rely on that sidewalk facility at the edge of the roadway to create the safest condition. Even a better condition would be to add a secondary pathway set back a bit from the road with some substantial landscaping. As you can see, that landscape strip is pretty wide. You can put in shade trees that have good trunk size to create a safer condition and have pedestrians not only in a better location with more shade, but closer to the front doors of uses they might want to go to. So it makes the sidewalk both more attractive and safer and more functional for users. And then again, to include a public plaza on each of the four corners with locations for public art. Again, the city's not required to pay for the public art. There's a fund already that does that. The developers would be required to landscape, improve, and light and maintain that plaza. But again, through the design and through the development review process, the city can require that be a publicly accessible plaza, so the public gets a piece of that back in terms of utility. So again, these slides illustrate that improvement. So apologies for the delay. I'm so sorry. I was trying to abbreviate the presentation because it was so very long, and thank you for your patience. I've been up here a long time. But nonetheless, some examples of how the city might want to consider the additional development coming in on those corners, again, with a substantial setback and reservation for a public plaza and public space in that most important intersection. It's Main and Main, really, for the whole southern end of the city, coming into the city. And some examples of how that space might look and feel. So there you go. So I wanted to answer your question, and yes, Millie.
It looks beautiful in the pictures. I've heard from more than a couple of people that they have planned the corners.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard from more than a few people that the plan for the corners, some of the corners, Wawa gas station,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
7-Eleven, CVS. It's not going to look anything like that. I'm sorry to say, we live right there.
So it is definitely the introduction of uses that aren't permitted in the city's code. The city council's already gone through that conversation and concluded those uses are uses they want to have there, okay? So how those uses exist on the ground is the design opportunity. And so having a setback, right? Wawas can exist in lots of different ways. Instead of a traditional Wawa, this one is going to have the building against the road and the canopies behind the building, so that you won't approach the site and see canopy. You'll approach the site and have building. So I can't disagree with you. A commercial use in this location is not a typical use that you would want to have adjacent to residential, but those uses have already gone through the conversation with the city council, and they're going to be, I think, ultimately developed there. But hopefully in a format that gives back some of those public features that we've been talking about all evening, okay? Shade trees and canopy trees, locations for public art, better accommodations for pedestrians and cyclists, pardon me, and building frontages that help reduce the setback space. So the building's set at the street edge, not behind the canopy of the gas station. So there's some frontage along the corridor that creates for a more functional sidewalk and a better appearance. But again, I hear your concerns. I know there was a lot of discussion on the dais when the project was coming through. This, though, is the approach the city has taken. If those uses are going to come, this is the way they'd like to see them, instead of the traditional way a gas station might be developed. Actually, I have a slide that shows that ratio. So, for example, again, we talked about the height to width ratios and the location of driveways and parking areas. So for example, the front to front and back to back relationships we discussed also exist for commercial properties as well. Gas stations play a role in that, right? So kind of a highway oriented design, which could be built theoretically if the council wanted to allow it, could put the building at the back of the site and the gas pumps in front of the site. So the front door of the site could be gas pumps, and the back of the site, the building. The alternative design is what we would suggest perhaps is more of a neighborhood-focused design, and in a more neighborhood-focused design, the building would be the first thing you meet on that site, and the canopy is the back of house. So the canopy takes place at the back of that lot. And this is actually the arrangement the City Council approved in its design review. And examples of how those exist. Kind of that more traditional wah-wah on the left-hand side. This happens to be in the city, actually, for a little bit further to the north. Where, again, what you can see, this is canopy. Here's the front. This property has actually a front and a side, but it feels like two fronts. And that canopy gas area is in the front of that site with the building at the back. The alternative, this happens to be over in Palm City. This is a road that was recently improved. This is an alternative design where the first thing you see on this site, at least from this roadway edge and the internal edge, is a building that's occupied, right? That has a roof and has more formality to it to help hold the edge of the street, with the canopy at what is considered the rear of this site. Okay? So again, I didn't mean to distract the discussion, but since you guys asked that question, I didn't want to, pardon me, not have a chance to bring you up to speed on those discussions that have taken place. Okay? So, Avi, could you switch back over to the tonight's presentation, please? Oh, can I do it? Ah, I love being in control. Fantastic. Is it this guy? Look at that, work in progress presentation. Okay, fast forward to the end of the presentation. There we go. Are there other questions in the Zoom room, Lauren? So, okay, so again, thank you for your input tonight. This is a long process for the city, right? Building a city takes a long time. It takes a generation to build a city. And so in the corridor study process, we're towards the end of our findings and recommendations, but it's really the beginning of the city's implementation. So there's a long way to go yet. Pardon me, the council has its retreat in a couple of weeks in July. We'll be presenting a summary of tonight's presentation along with the feedback that we heard from you and the folks in Zoom. So the council is up to speed on the findings and recommendations and what the public input has been along the way. And then with that, we'll develop a final report for the city that the city will be receiving later this summer. And then you'll see that advertised as it goes through its process and have a chance to continue to participate either in those hearings as they take place over time or directly with the city staff. Okay? And so with that, if you have other questions or comments, my contact information is available to you along with my email address, as well as Laura, who's the project manager. So, and with that, we would say thank you so much. Appreciate your time. Okay. Great.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Special thanks to Kim and Lauren with the Regional Planning Council for the excellent presentation. If there's anything you all would like to comment on or follow up, please contact us. Again, thank you so very much, and don't forget to grab a cookie on your way out.